Take a look at what's happening to America's farmers right now. Shipments of almonds, dairy, soybeans, and corn that once sailed out by the ton to China are now stuck at home, gathering dust. What used to be a steady flow of goods has suddenly turned into piles of unsold harvests. And the message from Beijing is unmistakable. Trump's protectionist trade war is landing its hardest blows on U.S. farmers. In Washington state, hay exporters are letting go of workers because Chinese buyers simply stopped showing up. These aren't just numbers in a government report. These are families losing steady contracts, losing paychecks, and in too many cases losing the future they spent years building. And this isn't the result of a drought, a flood, or one bad season. Farmers did their job. They planted, harvested, and prepared their crops. But when it came time to sell, the customers vanished. China, once the single largest buyer of American farm products, has closed its doors. Add in tough weather and rising costs, and the situation goes from bad to brutal. Every shipment that sits idle at a port, every farmer who doesn't get paid ripples outward, hitting truck drivers, food processors, local banks, and entire rural communities that depend on agriculture to survive. Stay with me because in just a moment, I'll show you how quickly this shock is spreading across the farm belt, how much damage has already been done, and why Washington has no real plan to pull these farmers out of the fire. And before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe because what's happening now is only the beginning, and the next stage of this crisis will be even harder to ignore. Only a few months ago, shipments to China were moving steadily. The system wasn't perfect, but at least farmers had a reliable buyer. Then came Trump's tariff hikes in April 2025. Within just 6 weeks, U.S. farm exports to China were cut in half. That's not a blip. It's billions of dollars in food suddenly left without a destination. In California's Central Valley, almonds that once moved straight onto ships are now stacked in warehouses after Chinese importers tore up their contracts. At the Port of Oakland, the story is the same. Almond and dairy exports have fallen by more than 40%. These are not projections or political talking points. They are real numbers showing that the Chinese market has stepped away almost overnight. And the brutal reality is that no other buyer is big enough to fill the gap. Europe already has its own overflowing supply. Southeast Asia takes some shipments, but nowhere near the scale needed. So what happens to the goods piling up? Milk, soybeans, corn, almonds? When there's no buyer, farmers can't hold them forever. The crops spoil, the milk is dumped, and silos fill to the brim. Each loss deepens the financial hole. And for farmers already carrying loans and high operating costs, the debt burden becomes crushing. This isn't isolated to one crop or one region. It's a chain reaction running through the entire farm economy. From California to Iowa, every shipment left unsold is another community pushed closer to collapse. The situation has become so desperate that farmers across the Midwest are publicly urging Trump to strike a deal with China, any deal, just to get the market back. So, how did this crisis begin? It traces back to Washington, D.C. and Trump's sweeping tariff campaign. In April 2025, his administration hit Chinese imports with duties reaching 145%, framing it as a strike against unfair trade. But Beijing's response was immediate and calculated. Tariffs on American farm goods aimed squarely at Trump's strongest political base. Economists had warned this would happen. Trade experts said China would not hesitate to retaliate, and they were right. But what makes this more than a short-term dispute is how China used the moment to accelerate a larger strategy. China isn't just refusing American farm goods, it is deliberately redirecting global trade flows. When soybean and corn purchases from the U.S. stopped, Brazil and Argentina were ready to step in. Those countries quickly signed fresh contracts filling ships bound for Chinese ports. Australia boosted its dairy and beef exports. Instead of disruption, China created new long-term supply lines. For Washington, the consequences go far beyond lost sales. Farmers who spent decades building access to Chinese markets suddenly saw those relationships evaporate. For Beijing, the crisis is a chance to deepen ties with South America, strengthen BRICS alliances, and present itself as a more stable trade partner than the United States. This is why the imbalance matters. China is the buyer. And in agriculture, the buyer doesn't just set prices. It decides which nations thrive and which ones are left behind. By choosing South America over America, Beijing is doing more than buying food. It is signaling that U.S. farmers once central to the global supply chain are no longer indispensable. What's happening in 2025 is more than a downturn. It's a structural shift. The Farm Belt is caught in the middle of a geopolitical contest. And the longer Washington clings to tariffs, the more permanent this realignment becomes. When China cut off American farm imports, it didn't sit back and wait for shortages to appear. Beijing moved quickly. Deliberately and on a massive scale, Brazil, Argentina, and other South American producers stepped into the space U.S. farmers once dominated, and within months, they became the new pillars of China's food supply chain. Take soybeans. China consumes more than 60% of the world's soybean supply, and for years depended heavily on U.S. farms. But once tariffs and tensions escalated, Beijing shifted its buying power almost entirely south. In 2023, Brazil exported over 54 million metric tons of soybeans to China, nearly 3/4 of all Chinese imports. By August 2025, that share had surged toward 90%. U.S. shipments, once central to Chinese food security, are now nearly erased. The fallout has been devastating at home. Silos across the Midwest are overflowing, prices are crashing, and farmers are left without markets. The same story plays out with beef, corn, dairy, and even poultry. Argentina and Uruguay have expanded their beef exports, while Brazil has become not only China's main soybean supplier, but also its top corn exporter after Beijing approved imports in 2022. And this wasn't some patchwork solution, it was a carefully designed pivot. China poured billions into South American agriculture to guarantee reliability. Rail lines in Brazil were upgraded, ports modernized, and cold storage expanded, much of it financed with Chinese loans or joint ventures. Beijing wasn't just buying food, it was building an entirely new logistical backbone that ensured American farmers could be replaced for the long term. Every ship leaving Santos or Paranagua with soybeans bound for China carried more than cargo. It carried proof that the United States was no longer essential. Every ship leaving Santos or Paranagua with soybeans bound for China carried more than cargo. It carried proof that the United States was no longer essential. Every ship leaving Santos or Paranagua with soybeans bound for China carried more than cargo. It carried proof that the United States was no longer essential. Every ship leaving Santos or Paranagua with soybeans bound for China carried more than cargo. It carried proof that the United States was no longer essential. But the partnership has grown beyond farming. China has also become the largest foreign investor in Latin American oil projects, tying countries like Venezuela, Brazil, and Ecuador to its capital. In Peru and Chile, Chinese firms control some of the world's largest copper mines, feeding raw materials into China's factories and renewable energy industries. Highways, power grids, and railroads across the continent increasingly carry the stamp of Chinese companies through belt and road financing. All of this links into the political framework of BRICS. Brazil has championed the bloc's expansion. Argentina applied to join, and countries like Venezuela and Bolivia openly aligned themselves with the idea of a multipolar world led by emerging economies. For South American governments, China offers more than a steady market. It offers development money without the political conditions that usually come with American or IMF aid. Meanwhile, Washington is losing more than contracts. It's losing influence in a region it once considered its own backyard. Trade numbers tell the story. By 2022, China had overtaken the U.S. as South America's largest trading partner with more than $500 billion in annual trade, a figure that has only grown since. And this isn't just about soybeans or copper. It includes technology deals, 5G networks, and even military exchanges. For American farmers, the stakes go far beyond empty silos. What's unfolding is a shift in the balance of power across the Western Hemisphere. BRICS provides the institutional glue for this transformation, giving South America a platform to challenge Western dominance. Each year that passes, Washington doesn't just lose sales, it loses trust, partnerships, and strategic depth in a region where its grip once felt unshakable. So the real question becomes, as South America moves closer to Beijing, will Washington admit that it is already on the losing side of this fight, or will it double down, risking an even deeper fracture that could permanently lock allies into China's orbit? Back on the ground, every farm closure in Iowa, every layoff in Washington state is a reminder that this crisis isn't passing through. It's structural. Markets lost today are unlikely to return. Trump speaks of patriotic farming and short-term sacrifice, but for those watching their debts rise and their harvests go unsold, there is no long-term reward waiting on the other side. Relief checks from Washington barely scratch the surface. They are bandages on a wound that keeps getting deeper, and everyone in farm country knows it. While trade routes are closing, another blow is coming from the banks. Credit that once kept farms alive is drying up. Lenders who used to finance seed purchases, equipment repairs, or land expansion are pulling back. They see the same numbers as everyone else. Without steady exports, farms can't generate the income needed to repay loans. That sets off a vicious cycle. Farmers can't borrow to plant. They can't sell what they do harvest, and they can't keep their operations afloat. Foreclosures are creeping upward, and the first to fall are small family farms buried under debt they never stood a chance of escaping. Yet the message from the Trump administration paints a different picture. Farmers are described as soldiers in an economic battle, asked to endure sacrifice in the name of long-term victory. But those promised victories aren't showing up. What farmers see instead are unpaid bills, shrinking communities, and the looming loss of family land that has been passed down for generations. On the other side of the ocean, Beijing is executing its strategy with precision. By cutting off purchases of American crops, China is putting direct pressure on Trump's political base in the Midwest. They know these rural states helped carry him into office. They also know that without international markets, American agriculture cannot survive. Each canceled contract doesn't just weaken the U.S. economy, it turns Trump's strongest supporters into frustrated critics. None of this is accidental. China is using trade as a weapon, shifting flows to South America and other partners while making American agriculture irrelevant in the long game. Now, step back and consider the deeper problem. Once those markets are gone, how do you rebuild them? If Brazil becomes China's trusted soybean supplier, what incentive does China have to return to the U.S.? If Europe steps in to meet China's dairy demand, why risk going back to a partner seen as unstable and unpredictable? These are not short-term deals. They are decadal-long supply contracts. Every extra month that the trade war drags on, the door closes further on U.S. farmers. And that's the reality many outside farm country don't yet grasp. It's not just about one season's harvest. It's about losing entire industries for a generation. And just as farmers are struggling with collapsing exports and tightening credit, another crisis is hitting from inside the country itself. Even for those who manage to keep their land, there's an entirely different problem waiting in the fields. Not enough workers to harvest the crops. American agriculture has always depended on migrant labor, especially from Mexico and Central America. These workers take on the hardest jobs that keep the system running. Picking lettuce in California's Central Valley, tending dairy herds in Wisconsin, and working long shifts in poultry plants across Arkansas. Without them, much of America's food supply chain simply cannot function. But Trump's immigration crackdown cut into that workforce just as farmers were already struggling with collapsing exports. Stricter border enforcement and cuts to visa programs dried up the farm labor pipeline almost overnight. Fields of vegetables went unpicked, crops spoiled before they could reach markets, and dairy producers faced the impossible task of keeping operations running without enough hands to do the work. Rather than offering relief, the administration doubled down, removing the very workers who kept agriculture afloat. That left farmers trapped in a perfect storm. No buyers abroad, no workers at home, and no meaningful support from Washington. Operations that had survived decades of natural disasters and price swings are now facing bankruptcy, not because of the weather, but because of politics. If this course doesn't change, the collapse of America's farm belt will not be remembered as an unavoidable tragedy, but as a self-inflicted wound. For more updates and deeper analysis on how this crisis is unfolding, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned, because the story of American farming is far from